Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that loves a filthy tractor with nice big mud flaps. And how are you, Rob?
I'm good. Yeah, no, I'm
Defeated
fine.
by your own joke, Rob.
Look, I write them, you deliver them. Okay, so there's a joy in a delivery sometimes. I am doing very well, thank you, Tom. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. I've had to put my foot up because I did a bit too much running last weekend, and then I've been non-stop all week. But I have some time to record, and hopefully the listeners won't hear Sweet Home Alabama playing in the background in the fair that's going on outside my house that I can't be bothered to walk to, even though it's literally on my doorstep because my foot hurts. But yeah. I mean, on the plus side, I get to be at home a bit, and what do we do when we're at home? We read the headlines. I'm not sure that was a particularly good link, but we'll go with it. So from the Metro, get a fine, will resign. I don't know if the question mark's fully conveyed there, but what's that about, Rob?
So this is a story about Currygate, as I believe it's been called by the papers, or at least one paper in particular, that being the Daily Mail, that has kind of continued its story about no, it's not Currygate, it's Beergate as well, about the picture that was taken of Keir Starmer having a beer with some people around him whilst there was a lockdown going on. This story has sort of like... So you've got all the big Partygate stuff that's still rumbling on, and even this week, even though the Met said that no fines would be issued whilst the local council elections were going on because of the Purdah rule, which means that you can't really be seen to be influencing results by other things happening around the election so close. They didn't want that to influence the election too much. This story has been rumbling on in the background, which is Labour's version, which is where they say that Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, who were in a house at the time helping to organise the local Labour Party for a by-election that was happening, they basically said that they broke social distancing rules, and basically they should get a fine that is equivalent to the fine that Boris Johnson has already received for what happened in the Houses of... Sorry, not in the Houses of Parliament, but in number 10 and the offices around there for, I believe his first one was issued for the birthday cake, but it's expected that there are more fines going to come along the way for Johnson. So I think this is a story where at least the Daily Mail, when they kept pushing it and running for it, they were looking to seek an equivalency with Keir Starmer, basically saying, look, Keir Starmer's a bit of a hypocrite. He said Boris Johnson should resign over this. He's called for it several times in Parliament. Partygate has had a big effect on the Conservatives. However, Labour are just as bad, and here's the reason why. And it's got to such a stage that now Durham police have already said that they will reopen the investigation and they will see if Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner broke any rules as a result of what they did back then. So the big difference here, what came out, everybody said, like, well, if, Keir Starmer, what are you going to do? You've told Boris Johnson you said Boris Johnson should resign. Boris Johnson hasn't, even though he's got those fines. What are you going to do if you get a fine from the police? And he said, yep, I'll step down as party leader if I do so, which I think is kind of a really good move from Keir. It's one of the few things, it's one of the few big things I can sort of point to and say, yeah, you've got this nailed on right, or I feel that this will go down well with the general public or people who are on the fence about it. Because if Keir Starmer resigns, first and foremost, it's not going to force Boris Johnson to resign. Boris Johnson is not going to resign out of pity or out of any sense of moral obligation. But that's the difference that Keir Starmer is trying to highlight there. He's trying to have a clear defining line between the parties and say, look, when I do something wrong, I take responsibility for my mistakes and I do the appropriate thing as leader, as any leader should. And he's hoping that, he's hoping that Durham police find him innocent because he believes himself to be innocent in this case. But if they do say that he's broken any rules, he says it's clearly the right thing for him to step down as Labour Party leader. And that makes him at least have have the moral high ground and the Labour Party have the moral high ground when it comes to accepting fines for those things. There's kind of a malaise that happens, and we saw it happening in America to a degree, where, Donald Trump does a load of things wrong, right? And there are things that he does wrong, and everybody clearly says, well, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And then a Democrat will do something wrong, just like one relatively minor thing in comparison to everything Trump's done, and somebody will come along from outside, or people who who don't read that much into politics and basically go, look at that, politicians, all the same, all as corrupt as each other, which I think is the wrong attitude to take from that, where it's like, well, Trump's got 20 things, this Democrat's got one. Clearly, one is more corrupt than the other, but if you want to take that conclusion away, fine, I guess. But if Labour's at least there, and Keir Starmer's at least there to say, no, we will take action on this, we will prove that we're not all the same, and that there are differences in politicians, and if you want to have a leader who is, who has some honesty and some integrity and these things that people classically have associated with prime ministers of the country, then you should vote for a Labour leader, which I think could play in. Obviously, it's not going to be good for Keir Starmer. It's quite a big political gamble to put your career on the line over this type of thing. But the fact he's come out and said it, I believe, has raised his standing a little bit because of that.
I agree. There's often, it's very much, I feel, a false equivalency where people say, oh, well, such and such said something, and they weren't, as you say, all politicians are the same. I think we can sit here and point out that the hypocrisy coming out of the Johnson government is definitely not the same as maybe one meeting that Keir Starmer went to. Like, sure, it's if he does get in trouble for it, it's not going to be a good look. Like, you can see how it's going to be spun by the papers. But like, they're like, oh, well, he called on Boris Johnson to resign, so he should resign. Well, do you know what Boris Johnson didn't do? Famously, he didn't resign. So like, that's such a stupid argument. Like, he called on someone to do something that they didn't do, so then he should do it. Just the logic isn't there for me. Yeah, unfortunate, but I think we'll see what happens in the coming week. So into our next headline, Tories pawn shame in the Commons from the Mirror. What was that about, and why does it involve tractors, Rob?
Yes, try and relate back to our original joke. We weren't just saying that we were tractor fetishists earlier on. This is the story that Conservative MP Neil Parish was caught watching pornography on his mobile phone, not once but twice, within the House of Commons, which sort of leaked to the papers and caused another scandal. And it's been, I think we touched on it last time when we were talking about Rishi Sunak and all of these little scandals that have happened with MPs along the way. This is like yet another one where it seems like just an own goal and a particularly like sleazy story to come out that is directly linked to the Conservative Party. His defence was really odd on this one. So he said that he was looking up tractors and he stumbled across...
I mean, not an unreasonable thing to look up, right? A tractor.
Apparently there is a make of tractor called the Dominator, which is how you make that link, because there are a lot of people saying, how do you search there are no tractors on Pornhub, for example, which I am led to believe that there are not. I haven't done the research, unlike Neil Parish. But yes, so he ends up there. The most bizarre thing about this was the way it was handled. First of all, so there is a clip online of Neil Parish on GB News when the news breaks that a Conservative MP has watched pornography in the House of Commons, and he just happens to be on there for a reason, and the presenter asks him for a comment. And of course he says, it's terrible. The MP in question probably should definitely have some punishment of some kind, where he's probably thinking in the back of my head, oh my goodness, this story is now out. What on earth do I do? Secondly, even though he'd admitted it, he refused to resign initially, basically saying that, we should wait for the details of an inquiry, and after the inquiry, it'll be decided if I should step down. Which, I know everybody loves an inquiry, and it does seem like that's a very Boris Johnson move. It typifies that, like, particularly with Partygate, like, I'll have to have an inquiry and if I went to a party, where it's like, you knew you were there, Boris. Much the same with Neil Parish. Like, you knew what happened. You've even admitted to people that you have watched it in the House of Commons. Why do we need an inquiry on this? You can just go now. And as a result, the whip was removed and he resigned as an MP. So that's yet another by-election that the Conservatives have on the horizon. I think that there are 3 or 4 in potentially very difficult areas. And, they've got a majority of 80. It's not going to overthrow the government. They're not that tight on numbers when it comes to winning votes in the Houses of Parliament. But again, it's just this slow leeching away of MPs in areas where probably they would be doing quite well. Like we talked last time how they lost one of the safest Conservative seats in history because of the Owen Paterson affair to a Liberal Democrat. Again, these are other seats that I can see going Liberal Democrat because they're in those areas. There's one up north which is likely to go back to Labour. But yes, they are just offering open goals to their opposition, and it remains to see if they can take them. But it's certainly not a good look for the Conservative Party at the moment.
No, I mean, well, I think good looks are out of fashion at Tory HQ by the sounds of it currently. And I just want to say, like, the story broke, and there was an argument he put forwards where he was like, "Look, I was looking at something." And I like left it up on my phone or something like that, and that was kind of the argument he tried to play. And I was like, which obviously, like, he's now resigned, so all of this is probably a moot point. But that was the argument he tried to play with, and then it transpired it had been twice. And it's like, I just don't understand the like. It's not just that it's completely inappropriate, which is strike one, right? The thing I just don't get is why you think that would, like, what do you get out of doing that work? Like, it's just such a weird concept. Like, I could understand if you had looked at something naughty on your phone previously, and then you opened your phone to the same tab and you hadn't, got rid of it, which would be the sensible thing to do if you'd actually thought about this for more than 5 seconds. Then maybe it could be on your phone. You probably shouldn't be doing it on your work phone to start with. Don't get me wrong, but like, if you're already in that situation where you've gone off, looked at something rather ribald, and then come back and then reopen your phone, it might be on display as an accident. But then, just why were you? I just don't understand the mindset of wanting to look these things up while you're in the middle of a parliamentary session. I guess it could be a very strange fetish, and we try not to kink shame here, but like, yeah, I just don't get it. I just don't get it at all. Like, it's what a stupid thing to lose your job over, really. It's like, yeah. I heard the story. I was just like, I don't get it. Like, it just makes no sense that someone would do such a thing and then lose their career over it. It's like, it's very different to other stories like this kind of thing that have come out. I think it's just so stupid. It's like, it's not that it's okay to use your work computer to look up porn anyway, which is a thing that happened in the US a lot. I think that was like a story way back when, and you're like, obviously that's not okay, that's inappropriate, but like, it's very different to like doing it in front of colleagues in the chamber. Like, that's such a weird, like, at what point did you stop thinking and let this happen? Anyway, I don't think I need to really add any more to that, as he has resigned, but it was just such a weird one to me. So moving on to our next headline, Defiant Truss, we will rip up Brexit border deal. And I saw this on the front of the Express, I think, as I was walking into work on Friday. So, what's that all about, Rob?
Yeah, I just want to touch on this quickly because it's probably something that might be a main headline in the future if it comes to pass. But there have been rumblings for 2 years now that Boris Johnson's not too happy with this guy who negotiated this Brexit deal way back in 2019 and organised a border down the Northern Irish Sea. So Boris Johnson's having a bit of an argument with himself on this one, and basically saying that the UK wants to renegotiate parts of the deal it did with the EU when it decided to leave. Most importantly, that bit about what happens in Northern Ireland that has been subject to a different amount of customs checks, essentially, and different tariffs on their goods and services that enter the area, basically because it shares a land border with the EU. So when that happens, the EU wants to protect its trading bloc. So yeah, it doesn't want people to get around that by sneaking stuff into Northern Ireland and through its ports. So it has to have a slightly different arrangement for that part of the country. This has also kind of come into the spotlight now because of two major developments. So the Attorney General, who is Suella Braverman, has come ahead and said, yep, I think it's entirely legal for the government to rip up this part of our treaty, which is another green light for the government to go ahead and do this in the future. I must say that Suella is she's a member of cabinet. She's a Conservative, so it's likely that she would have this point of view. It's not like they've got an independent legal tribunal, and it is likely to, if this happens with Britain, if Britain decides to go down this line, it will be discussed and it will almost certainly end up in a court of law if they decide to rip up this part of the treaty. But at least the government thinks that it's legal. Secondly, and I will touch this on very briefly because it's not fair for me to try and wade in on Northern Irish politics when I understand very little about it. But in tandem with the council elections, which are going to be our main headline, and we'll spend most of our time talking about that, we also had the elections for the Northern Irish Assembly, and for the first time ever, Sinn Féin won those over the DUP, which means you now have in control in Northern Ireland a party that wants Northern Ireland to reunify with the rest of Ireland, which clearly the British government doesn't want, and the DUP is kicking up a fuss and refusing to stand in those assemblies to even make that a valid thing. So you have, in a very tense area, you have problems flaring up, and the potential for there to be more disagreement over where Northern Ireland sits, either in the United Kingdom or within Ireland. One of the biggest things the DUP has gone on about is that they think they are unfairly treated. by this Brexit deal that makes Northern Ireland be treated differently to the rest of the UK. So they want it ripped up as well. So it might be an attempt by Boris Johnson as well to save the union, or feel that he's doing that by trying to renegotiate this treaty. Most importantly, it wasn't mentioned in the Queen's speech that that's what they wanted to do. So there are still question marks about how high up the government's agenda the changing moves of this treaty are going to be. There was some saying that it might be announced next week, even though it wasn't mentioned in the Queen's speech, which would kind of be bizarre for something of this scale. It almost makes me feel that they're like, they want to, we've talked about like the UK and the EU sort of saber rattling, saying, oh, I'm going to do this really bad thing if you don't agree with me, and then never doing the bad thing. I wonder if it is just a bit of saber rattling to get the EU to renegotiate the deal slightly, but avoid the UK ripping it up altogether. Because ultimately, I do think that the other reason I think this is a bizarre thing for the government to do right now is that if you rip that deal up with the EU, and you compromise trade with the EU, then you may start a trade war at a time where families are already feeling a squeeze and, finding the cost of living going up. If that is exacerbated because the government wants to pick a fight with the EU, then I don't know how well families are going to react to that. I know that Brexit was, a popular idea for a lot of people for that to go ahead, but if it starts hitting their back balances more and it's directly linked to, Britain shooting itself in its own foot, or being the ones to instigate that change again to start a trade war with the EU, then that could end up pretty badly for the Conservative government. So, that's a headline. It's more of a wait and see, but would be big news if it actually came to pass.
Big news if true. I don't think I have much more to add on that. The whole, it's so stupid. Just, I feel like a lot of my reaction to the news recently has been like, sigh, why are they doing a stupid thing? And the whole, we're going to go back on our international treaty we signed rhetoric was stupid when we discussed it, the first time round. And it's still stupid in my opinion. Very risky. And I mean, I know we had previously kind of joked about, not just us, the two of us, I mean, like as a country, joked about the idea that Boris might be overseeing the end of the union and stuff because Scotland pushing for independence, but Ireland reunifying has a higher chance as well. There was a poll I think done in 2019 about it where it had just been edged out, to the point where it was like a Brexit margin, where if Ireland and Northern Ireland voted, it would just win, which isn't really enough for a mandate for it to happen. But that was the first time I think it had moved over to that side. And, with 3 years and a lot of stupidity from a Tory government down the line, I would not be surprised if that has changed, especially as you said, we now have Sinn Féin in the lead over there. So, I guess jumping off from that, we can move into our main headline, which is the local council elections across, England, Wales, and Scotland.
Yeah, this is always exciting. I always like these episodes because I get to talk about elections and votes. And I think this is one where we're like, I seem to remember, and I might be misremembering, but I seem to remember like me and you in an abandoned scout hall recording, when we all met up.
Yes, that was pre-pandemic. We were on a birthday camp together and we got to record in a room, and that's really good. And I wish we could do more of these in person. Maybe as things are now opening up again, that will become possible again.
But this is the rerunning of those seats, and thinking how much politics has changed within those 4 years from 2018 to nowadays is quite striking. So I thought we'd just sort of take it party by party and see how they go, and give a few reasons why the results went that way.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's what we normally do. So I guess we'll be doing them in order of size. That's normally how we do this. So the Conservatives, they're currently in charge of the government. How did they fare in these local elections? I think this is the first chance at the ballot box for people to kind of, start to share their opinion about things like Partygate. Obviously, local elections also include local voting about local issues as well. But what the party is doing nationally always tends to have some effect.
Yeah. So I think the Conservatives went into this election expecting quite a bad result. And apart from a few caveats, I think this was quite a bad result for them, but it's sort of been hidden in a number of ways for them. So let me just get the number of seats up that they lost. So the Conservatives lost 485 councillors and lost control of 11 councils in total. I think most notably they lost Westminster, which is a council that has been Conservative for like forever, as far as I can tell. Keir Starmer basically opened his Queen's Speech retort with a congratulations to the Prime Minister for being the first Prime Minister ever to be living under the control of a Labour council, which provoked much laughs from the backbenchers behind him. So yeah, they went in there, and I think they expected to lose a lot of seats for, not surprisingly, as you mentioned in your introduction there, Partygate. Clearly, we've been looking at the polls for a while now, and when did things start to take a tip? When things started to go badly for the Conservatives and when they consistently started to dip under Labour and underperform them, it's almost a direct correlation to when those first Partygate rumours came out in December, and then like the Owen Paterson stuff and the resulting, like Sue Gray's going to investigate 20 parties or whatever it is. That's when their public opinion really starts to go down. However, the results are hidden for them. I don't think it was as bad as they expected for a number of reasons. First being the seats that they were defending weren't very Conservative at all. So we're comparing them with 2018 results, which is one where that's where Jeremy Corbyn was still in power. On our podcast back then, we discussed how Labour performed, and we said, Labour have really outperformed themselves in places like London, where support for them is already quite high, but maybe underperformed in the north. We were starting to see that sort of like Brexit divide happening up there, and a view that Jeremy Corbyn was still too London-centric and wasn't listening to those, or was out of touch with the voters in the north. I think this kind of shows that hasn't changed within, how people differentiate between Labour and Conservatives in both of those areas. If anything, Labour are now getting stronger in London than they were before. There was, back in 2018, there was a ward in London. It was one of the only ones that went to the Conservatives where everyone else went Labour, and the reasoning behind that was it had quite a strong Jewish community in there, and you had all that scandal about Jeremy Corbyn back then and how he was able to treat anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. The fact that council went back into Labour control maybe suggests there that at least Keir Starmer has been able to put that behind him for Labour, and that doesn't play into the hands of the Conservatives. So yeah, bad night for the Conservatives in London in particular. Where it was less of a bad night is when you're looking up north. They didn't lose those seats in what was sort of like the old red wall up there, or they didn't lose as many as they thought they would. So that sort of suggests, to me anyway, and I've also checked with John Curtis, the BBC's elections expert, and he seems to agree with me. So this isn't just me talking out of my bottom. That those old sort of Brexit lines still exist up there, at least. So where we saw that change in 2018 and 2019, as people started to think that, all the Conservatives are maybe culturally more of my cup of tea and I want to move towards Labour, that's still playing into the Conservatives' hands. Not as much. They are still losing seats, but those people aren't automatically going back to the Labour Party. They might be stopping by, they might be voting for Reform UK instead. They might be, UKIP isn't so much of a factor now, but they might be putting their votes elsewhere and not going back to Labour. So that's why I think it's been a muted response there. The Conservatives' major losses for them, however, all came in Wales and in the south of England, which is a worry. So one, if you go to Wales, that's where the Conservatives kind of had that. It's the opposite to what happened up in the north, I feel. In the north, we saw those Brexit lines still existing and still being in place. Wales was also an area that I think, when you look at how it was broken down, the Brexit results actually voted majority in favour of Brexit. However, it appears that all those people have now decided that the Conservatives are not the party for them and are either not turning out or deciding to go back to the Labour Party. They lost 87 councillors, I believe, in Wales, and really it was a really poor showing compared to how they did back in 2018. So it shows they've certainly got a problem there. Also down south, we'll come to talk to them because it's hard to talk about just one party when you're going through one, because when one party loses, there's another one that succeeds. But when you go down south, that's where the Conservatives will be worried that their traditional blue wall seats, the ones they feel they don't have to worry about because They literally always vote Conservative, and you had a number of councils down there that are traditionally very sort of like low tax councils. We don't tax very much, traditional Conservative values. We hope that our traditional Conservatives will come out and reward us. Instead, those seem to flip to the Lib Dems instead, who will go on to say, but they had a very good night at the Conservatives' expense. And I think that's where, if I was coming to Conservative HQ and I was saying, like, right, where are our major problems? What do we need to fix before going to the next election? They won't be so worried that their current course of action says that we're probably going to leak some MPs in the north, but we can afford to lose 10 or 20 up there. We've got an 80-seat majority, okay? We'll be fine. We'll still have a majority if we keep them. The real problem is if they also start leeching those MPs from those down south, those ones that are long-time traditional Conservatives who, it appears, seem to be alienated by Boris Johnson's form of leadership within that Conservative Party. Because, as I said, all those councils down there, they're not doing the radical things. They're not doing the Rwanda migrant scheme, are they? They're not saying that they're going to rip up the Brexit treaty. They're just low tax councils. And maybe those thought that, if we stick this election on, we keep it to local values, we might be able to convince people that we're different from those in Westminster and we'll keep our seats. There were, in fact, a lot of people saying that election literature that was going out in those Southern Conservative seats was labelled local Conservative instead of Conservatives, and they were even appearing on the ballot paper as such. And all of their sort of like leafleting was saying, look, we know Boris Johnson's been a bit of a fool, but don't listen to him. We're still on your side for your local area. And that still wasn't enough to people to keep voting for them. And instead, they changed their minds, mostly the Liberal Democrats. So, it's how the big question for Boris Johnson now is, how does he walk that tightrope? How does he get those people back on side for the general election, but still be able to reach those places that he couldn't reach back up in the north? Because that's how the Conservatives keep winning. The Conservatives have a great control over England in particular. I don't think I mentioned it yet, but the Conservatives also had an awful night in Scotland, losing over 60. They're one of the biggest losers in Scotland as well. So they are definitely losing out in places that aren't England. All of the Conservative success, if they want to run Parliament again, means they have to win England and win it big. And at the moment, I don't think they can quite do that. Well, we'll go on to what the national polls say, because it's not a bad strategy for the Conservatives to win. It certainly helped them win the general election back in 2019. But that coalition of voters that they put together at that election is starting to show the first signs of fragmenting.
And I mean, I think we've discussed before what Boris might have to do in order to win the next general election, but I think it's becoming increasingly likely that it's the age-old get rid of your leader not too long before the general election and be like, oh, we're a new party again, us the Conservatives. Oh no, that wasn't us, that was like Labour, wasn't it? Even though it's been 15 years we've been in power. So I think that's probably the way it's going to go, as regards having to, I think if Boris goes into the next general election, he won't win. There's a free prediction for you. But, he's managed to survive a lot of other things so far, but this has been the first time the poll numbers have consistently stayed down for the Conservatives. So with them trending downwards, and Labour on the up and up in the polls, how did Labour fare in the local elections? Yeah,
so I've sort of touched on it a bit in my Conservative response, but they've done very well in London, where they were expected to perform well, and they've sort of increased on that. They did lose one council to the Conservatives, Harrow, I believe, which was a bit, was the one big shock of the night that went that way. I don't know why. I don't know if it looks like it was quite tight, and I don't know if that boils down to there being more local factors in play. But that was certainly seen as one sort of like big stain on what happened on Labour's night. There was also a worrying loss for Labour up in Kingston upon Hull, where the Lib Dems were able to gain that for Labour. So Labour did, Labour had a good night in the fact that they won. They're up in councillors. They went up 108 councillors, and most importantly, they gained the most councils out of any party. So they gained overall control of 5 councils, which means, them having to be able to, say, right, this is a Labour authority, we have entire control, and now we can put our policy in place. That's a good thing for them. However, as we've said, they didn't really make the inroads in the north, which will worry them. It'd be a worry that they can't get those traditional red wall seats voters to come back to their party when, as we mentioned before, with how badly the Conservatives are doing, the Conservatives have got Partygate, You've also got this massive cost of living crisis, which the Conservatives seem to be unable or unwilling to solve. I didn't mention this, sorry, when I was talking about the Conservatives, and I should have done, but there was a particularly bad interview Boris Johnson had on Good Morning Britain on ITV, where he was presented with a case study of Elsie, a pensioner who has to, who is living off a meager income from her pension. She has to buy her food only using the yellow labels. She has to go without heating. She goes on the bus all day to travel around London to make sure that she stays warm. And Boris Johnson's response to that, or one of his responses, was, well, I brought in the free bus pass so she could do that, which isn't really the response that you're looking for from your leader. It's like, yeah, no, you might have done, but I don't think the solution is that we just pack loads of pensioners into all the buses on London and help them keep warm, Boris. You need to actually do something about this. And whereas the Conservatives have refused to put a tax on energy companies to try and cut bills and cut energy costs in the short term, whereas Labour said they had, I think Labour thought they were onto a bit of a vote winner there, and they could really capitalise that up where people are struggling, particularly up in the north of the country. They thought that message would come through. It appears it hasn't. So Keir Starmer will be worried that, if this is the Conservatives at their weakest and we still can't make inroads up there, then we've got to worry what happens if they bounce back for whatever reason, or if they're able to recover from these two. What if the economy turns around by 2024? Does that mean those seats automatically go back to the Conservatives? That's where they've got that big worry. Where it was a really good night for Labour, and I don't think this was picked up on the media coverage just because the results came in so late, but in Wales, they got loads of seats in Wales.
I think, there's the general issue where England is focused on a bit more, and I think even, like we touched on Northern Ireland earlier, which is a pretty big deal, I would say, in general. But Northern Ireland tends to get kind of sidelined even in the coverage when it's like a big election for them, because people tend to focus more on England. And yeah, I think that's an issue that needs to be fixed. But so let's talk about Wales and not keep talking about England.
It's a very brief point on Wales, but if we compare Wales to like the north of England, those are two places where you would have said 20 years ago that traditionally that those areas always vote Labour, right? You would have them, no doubt in my mind, those will always vote Labour, and they probably will forever and ever and ever. And that changed in 2019 to a degree. And the Conservatives were starting to make some inroads into Wales and looking to get more MPs there. It looks like all of that work has been undone so far. Labour picked up 67 councillors. The Conservatives lost 86. So at least I think Labour might be slightly reassured that that's a good example of voters we lost are now coming back to our party, or they now see it as our natural home. And maybe the one other good thing for Labour that came out of these results is that there was a theory that was going along basically saying that the Conservatives are going to do badly at this set of elections because traditional Conservative voters will stay at home. We'll see a depression in turnout, and when that turnout goes down, that'll be really bad for the Conservatives. However, turnout for this election was only about like a percentage point down. So probably everybody who could have voted went out and voted like they usually did, and they decided not to vote Conservative. They might not have voted Labour, but they were voting in an anti-Conservative manner, and that will at least feed into helping Labour become the largest party in Parliament, even if it doesn't pick them up the overall majority, because that's the real problem they've got. If Labour, because of the SNP, they're being so strong up in Scotland, and when we have a look at the results in Scotland quickly, although the Conservatives lost 63 in Scotland, the SNP gained 22, Labour gained 20, the Lib Dems gained 20. So Labour aren't winning those voters back in Scotland. It does mean that they are reliant on more voters in England if they ever want to have an outright majority when it comes to a general election. And at the moment, that still looks unlikely for Keir Starmer, that he would still have to rely on a coalition with another party, most likely the SNP. And Labour are worried about that because it was that idea in people's heads that they feel lost them the 2015 election, and that's what led to David Cameron having a shock government that ultimately led to the Brexit referendum and the hellscape we live in now. So yes, that's the electoral maths for Labour is still not quite there. That's why they'll be frustrated. That I think they really wanted this to let's kick the Conservatives while they're down and get them really scared. Haven't quite laid the finishing blow yet, but things are trending in the right direction. They just want that curve to be a wee bit steep.
So I think we touched on this a bit earlier as well, but I think it was a relatively good night for the Lib Dems, wasn't it, Rob?
Yeah. I think that they're the big success story of the night. And to be honest, I'm not really surprised anymore by this. And I mean that in a good way, because where we've seen lots of like by-elections happen, for MPs that have gone the way of the Lib Dems before this. They're the ones, that Owen Paterson one, where a very conservative constituency went Lib Dem for the first time in ages, showed that they were making real inroads into what we call the blue wall down south. And some of their biggest wins came, I think the big shock, at least for me locally, was Wandsworth or Somerset Council, which had been Conservative for a long time. That was a surprise victory for the Lib Dems. And it showed that they were able to take like those very rural seats, ones where Labour would always be beaten into a distant third place. People are either tactically voting or seeing that the Lib Dems have a real possibility of beating the Conservatives in those areas, and they're taking the opportunity to vote for them. Now, obviously, local elections are not national elections, and that is a very important point to make when you're speaking about the Lib Dems, because I do feel that part of their USP, one of their unique selling points, is that they genuinely care, and they put this across very well in their election literature, that they are very local. They thrive on local politics and making sure that, you're not listened to by the major two parties who are always squabbling in Westminster and are Westminster-centric. At the Lib Dems, we'll focus on your local issues and make sure we bring those to the forefront, and will always be your biggest local champion, which is why I think they are able to capitalise in these councils so very well. Also, as we were talking about the Conservative weakness at the time, as we talked about Brexit having effect up in the north, and that meaning that voters weren't moving from away from the Conservatives back to Labour, those divide lines, even though Brexit is over to an extent, those sort of cultural divides that came up, you've got Conservatives on the right wing of the party, and you've got those on the left wing of the party, those softer Conservatives, those ones who would have voted Remain. I think you've got a lot of those in those rural constituencies who are now feeling more and more isolated by the policies of Boris Johnson's government and how he appears to be bringing the party further and further to the right. I don't think those people in the south might have been affected so much by the cost of living crisis, or that would have factored into their thing, but I think they would have been more upset about how Partygate's been handled, about how how you've got this new migrant policy and how you're selling off Channel 4, that kind of stuff. I think that's the thing that would affect those softer Conservative voters, and they see the Lib Dems as another political home where they can get across their voice and make it clear to Boris Johnson that, hey, we want you to move back in this other direction. So yeah, that's why the Lib Dems are beginning to benefit so well. They won the most amount of councillors on the night, so they won 224 in total. They only took control of 3 councils in comparison to Labour's 5. But I think it's fair if you considered how, when you're again, you've sort of got to compare this to what happened before. Back in 2018, when these elections happened last time, the Lib Dems were at quite a low ebb and maybe a bit politically homeless. What do? They were the party of Remain, but did Remain matter in the local council elections? Probably not to the same extent. So their main selling point at that time wasn't as relevant to voters. Now I do feel that they've really found their feet, where they can be this home for the soft Conservatives leaving the party because of what they see in the negatives they see in Boris Johnson, and they're really reaping the rewards. And I think they're also helped by a lot of sort of tactical voting. There is less of there was a time where, particularly after their coalition with David Cameron, where it wasn't cool to vote Lib Dem. You had to hold your nose if you voted Lib Dem, or you'd feel that you were like, oh yeah, they are I know Labour can't win here, and the Lib Dems are their main competitor, but I'm not willing to vote for the Lib Dems because I feel that they are so closely aligned to the Conservative Party that I can't even lend them their vote to try and get a Conservative out. Now I feel more people are like that tactical voting thing. They're really saying, yep, if it gets rid of Conservative, I'll vote Lib Dem. That's a blow to the Conservative Party. That's another reason why they're getting those votes. So yeah, great night for the Lib Dems. I think Ed Davey will be very, very happy, and it's all of those blue wall seats you've got to look out for. It's down in the south where you've got all of those by-elections happening and those MPs, and the Lib Dems will go into those by-elections now feeling very confident that they'll be able to take another few more Conservative scalps, because yeah, they've got that track record now, they've got the momentum behind them, so yeah, why not?
I guess one thing that was interesting for me locally was, so we had our local elections. And we briefly, as a seat, toyed with a Conservative MP back just before Brexit. And as you know, my seat's Ed Davey's seat. So Ed Davey won that back, and obviously is now the leader of the Lib Dems. It was very interesting to just see, like, I mean, there's a back and forth between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives in this kind of general area, but we actually have 0 Tory councillors now. It's just fully Lib Dem. And in fact, I think, judging by the numbers, and I mean, you always have to wonder about the kind of Lib Dem style bar charts and things like that. But the only person I spoke to actually was from the Greens, who was like, the Tories are doing really badly here, and it's Lib Dems or Greens. And we ended up with all Lib Dems, but I think there probably is a decent amount of Green vote floating around as well in areas like this, where they are tending to vote Lib Dem. Although it didn't turn into any councillors for the Greens here, I'm sure it did elsewhere. I know we're going to get to the Greens in a bit, but it was just kind of an interesting, here's the view from one particular Lib Dem seat that's gone as Lib Dem as it possibly can, which is interesting. I think, I mean, the area I'm in, you do hear some people who very much sound like they would vote for Conservatives, but I think that they're switching enough of them are switching their allegiance. This time I think I've seen one vote Conservative, like poster outside of a house in a really posh area. But most of the ones I've seen have been vote Lib Dem, and clearly it's worked for them here. I think also probably tactical voting. The students in the area probably just didn't bother to vote Labour. That probably also helped, as he said, like, by not voting, but by basically ensuring you vote in a way the way you don't get the Tories in. Which is, based on some anecdata, based on what I've seen around here, that seems about right. Okay, I mean, well, we've just touched on the Lib Dems, and then I mentioned the Greens, so I guess maybe we should talk about the Greens more generally. They didn't get any seats here, but how do they do overall?
Yeah, I think that this has been overlooked, but the Greens had a really outstanding night. They won 87 councillors, which is more than doubled the total of councillors they had before this night. So I think that goes to show, as an increase in your vote percentage and how much you're making a dent in there. That's incredible to only win. I'm trying to do some quick math here. 2 seconds. What's the difference between 108 and 87? It is 31? No, 21. 21. Yeah. They only won 21 fewer seats than Labour.
Yeah.
Which, when you compare it to that, it's like, oh, wow. And I think that is where, again, we were talking about Labour and where they may have lost out on votes. I think Labour is also losing some votes to those on the left of their party, those who still feel a bit, miffed that Corbyn's gone and the party doesn't seem to be quite as on the left as it once was. The Greens are mopping up those votes as well, and they're gaining big time. So, again, we've always said that Labour's got this bit of a squeeze on where, where they're leaking some vote, where they were leaking some voters to the Conservatives, and now those ones that were leaked aren't coming back. They are again leaking some voters to the Greens, particularly in council elections. Now, when it comes to a general election, I feel that effect will be lessened because there is only one Green MP. I wouldn't imagine that the Greens would pick up multiple more MPs when they get to, because of the nature of our system, I don't think they would win more. However, the fact that they are clearly still gaining in popularity and they're still seen as a viable place to put your vote and have a councillor. Like having to get yourself recognised as a serious political force, having councillors helps. Back before, the 2016 referendum, or when we were in that Brexit purgatory of, we've voted to leave, but we haven't actually left there. That's when we saw a big surge in UKIP councillors and them becoming oh my goodness, they're taking lots of seats off Conservative councillors. That you see that groundswell, and that's where parties will look at that and they will try and change some of their policy direction to try and get that. So I think the Labour Party does need to try and get those Green votes somehow, or otherwise, in a couple of tight contests, if you end up losing an MP because 5% of that constituency decided to vote Green instead of Labour, then they're going to be kicking themselves. So wonderful nights for the Greens. Shows that they're going to stick around and they're still a political force to be reckoned with. Comparing it to UKIP, who I said, were a force once. I had a look at the overall results. UKIP lost all of their councillors last night. They only had 3 to begin with, but lost all 3, and that kind of shows that sometimes these little parties are big for a while and then fade out. I believe the Greens are still a force that will continue to have a big effect in politics for a while. Yeah,
it's a bit of a shame, I feel, that the electoral calculus people haven't updated yet since we last spoke, because they do it on a monthly basis. So I imagine we'll get some data at the end of the month. So we'd have to kind of have a look based on that. Their previous prediction, as we discussed last time, said Labour 11 short of a majority. But I think we should go and have a look at our political polls of polls. It's not a massive change, I don't think, really, if you look at the polls. What you do notice is as May ends, the Lib Dems and the Greens jump up a little bit and Labour lose a tiny bit of that. And the Conservatives have actually been sat on 34% since all the Partygate kind of stuff came out. So Labour took a tiny bit of a hit, but that's going to Lib Dems and Greens. And you get overall, that kind of ties in with what we've seen. Reform is still sat there on 2%, but it's clearly not enough for them to actually get anything. No, I mean, yeah, I don't think there's much more to add to the polls after what we've just discussed. I mean, as we always say, an election is the best kind of poll to get to the actual results. So, yeah.
Yes. There was one poll that I saw, and this is me. Nate Silver would be telling me off right now because you never use a single poll and extrapolate from that because it feels a bit bad. But it was one of the more recent ones I saw that came out on the 10th, 11th of May from YouGov, and it showed the voting intention. And the biggest thing I saw from that is a jump up of 2% from Labour and a drop of 2% from the Conservatives, leaving Labour on 38% and the Conservatives on 33%, which feels like once you get to sort of like 5% territory, it feels bigger. And before they've been quite close. I wonder if I was trying to think like, oh, what would influence that? And the only thing that I can think from it could influence that is that Keir Starmer decision to say, I'll resign if I get my fine, which even though it's weird that we're seeing everything through the lens of Partygate at the moment when it comes to these two parties, because, there's a cost of living crisis, which I think would be most important on most people's minds for where they put their vote next. But something like that kind of shows me that, yeah, that's them trying to get more electable, or that's what's caused the bounce up, because those local election results, as we said, weren't anything to really... The Labour Party weren't shouting them from the mountaintops. They were happy, but they weren't saying, now we're ready for government at the top of their voice. Keir Starmer's little decision to make take up a stand and resign if found guilty, I do think has played into there. That's my extrapolation anyway from that very tiny bit of data. Let's look at the polls next time and see if that holds out, or if it was just a minor blip up, and if other polling companies don't quite see the same movement.
Yeah, and I mean, as you say, you can't trust one poll. We have to take an average, and then even then, polls don't always get things right. But yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, it looks like writing's on the wall for the current Conservative government. And I think, like I said earlier, I think we either end up with a different leadership of the Tory party into the next general election, or Boris goes into another general election and loses. I know there was some talk about him maybe calling an early general election. I saw that doing the rounds, but I don't know what polls he's looking at, because I think if he was to call one, I mean, maybe if he was to call one now, I don't think it would work out well for him at all. And it would seem like a silly power grab again, and I think that would probably go against what he wants, basically. But yeah, we can only wait for the inevitable general election when it happens, unless it gets called earlier. And I don't really think there's a good reason for the Conservatives to call it earlier at the moment. They can just push stuff through Parliament pretty much all the time.
The only reason I can see him pushing it through, and this is me being very cynical, is if what if calling a general election delays the Sue Gray report? Like how there was meant to be that Russia report and it never came out until after the election, and the Russia report reflected on the Conservatives in a pretty bad light, and everybody thought, it was weird that had to be delayed and put until after the election. That's me being my most cynical, like Boris Johnson saying, right, I got to get out ahead of this thing that ends my career to try and extend my career. And then if it comes out after I've won a 50-seat majority, then nobody will care because the public still love me anyway. You wouldn't get rid of a leader a month after he's just been in power. That's madness. You've got to give him a chance. But yeah, you saying that the Conservatives are thinking now's time to cause a general election, that's mad. I know they were down in the polls when he called one back in 2019, and we all, for about a month there, they were like, oh, what are the Lib Dems going to do really well all of a sudden? They were polling really high when, you remember when Parliament was falling in on itself and nobody quite knew what to do. The Conservatives were polling really quite lowly there, and then through the campaign and their clear, vote for us and we'll get Brexit done, that was able to drive them to victory. So maybe that's what he's thinking there, but I just don't know what Conservative policy or slogan could get everybody back on board, particularly when they seem to have, as I said earlier, I think this cost of living thing and their reaction to it, I don't know what slogans they would go into in a general election now saying how they're going to solve that crisis. It does seem to be literally the worst time for them to call a general election. So yeah, fingers crossed they don't do it soon, because that would be lots of podcasts in a short period of time.
Yeah, I've added all I want to add on this topic first. So next time, I don't know what the news will throw us. We are rapidly approaching summer and the possibility of some silly season specials. So I guess get on Twitter, Reddit, etc. I will list all those places now. So you can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at unparlpodcast. And you can also find us at our website, parliamentary.observer, where you can comment on these episodes. So if you do have a silly season special you'd like us to do, tell us in any of those ways. Tweet at us, comment on an Instagram post, whatever you want to do. We will get that information and we can compile some ideas for silly season specials. I still want to kind of do my science not being understood by the media one. I think that would be quite good. I just need the time to write some notes for it, but as I'm changing job, I guess I might have a bit more time to do that. And then, yeah, a few other things. I'm sure we'll come up with something. Continue our kind of basics of politics discussions that we've had before. Those have been generally quite popular. But yeah, if there's anything you want us to talk about, let us know. You can even comment on our YouTube videos that we upload when the episodes go live. So yeah, whichever method you want to use to get that information to us, do please. And yeah, without further ado, I don't think there's anything else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Tracked. Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open.